Hi, welcome back. So in today's video, we're going to do something very exciting. I'm going to show you a sample debate round. So I have my sister Lily here, who's also an LDer, and we're going to debate each other in an actual LD round to show you what it's like. So we're not actually debating the current year's resolution because I don't have cases written for it right now, but we are going to be debating a previous resolution, which is resolved nationalism ought to be valued above globalism. That's the topic or the resolution we're debating, and I'll put that up on the screen. So Lily's going to be defending the side of nationalism. She's going to be on the affirmative side. I'm going to be on the negative side. I'm going to be defending the side of globalism. So as we go through this debate round, don't worry if you're confused or if you don't understand what's going on. I haven't taught you anything yet. You don't know exactly how LD works. So this is sort of just to give you a feel of what an LD round looks like. But you're not expected to know what's going on. So don't worry if you get confused or if you don't understand. We're going to explain all of that as we go throughout this course. So just to give you a feel. And one last thing before we start, normally when we're debating, we would be in suits because when you go to a tournament, you're required to be in a suit. But I'm recording this in my living room, which is why I'm not in a suit. So just something to keep in mind. So without further ado, we're going to start the debate round. Lily, the affirmative team, or the affirmative speaker, is going to start by reading her affirmative case. And this round will last about 45 minutes, and we'll give you a great idea as to what LD is like. And we also have a timer in the background, which you can't see, is going to be giving us hand signals and telling us how much time we have left. So, take it away, Lily.
All right. Is the timer ready? Okay. Imagine that there are two children, and both of them have the same sickness. One child belongs to you, while the other child has no relation to you. If you could only cure one of these sick children, which one would you cure? You would cure your own child, because your duty as a parent is to preserve your own child's health and well-being. Because nationalism better preserves a nation's well-being, I stand resolved. Nationalism ought to be valued above globalism. Here are some definitions. Collins' English Dictionary defines nationalism as, quote, the doctrine that national interest, security, etc. are more important than international considerations, end quote. Dictionary.com defines globalism as, quote, the attitude or policy of placing the interests of the entire world above those of individual nations, end quote. Essentially, nationalism places priority on protecting one's own country, while globalism puts the emphasis on other countries. In addition, Macmillan Dictionary defines value as, quote, to consider someone or something to be important, end quote. And Oxford English Dictionary defines priority as, quote, a thing that is regarded as more important than others, end quote. My value in this debate is preservation of a nation. Preservation of a nation. A nation is defined by Merriam-Webster as, quote, a community of people composed of one or more nationalities and possessing a more or less defined territory and government, end quote. And your dictionary states that, quote, preservation is the act of maintaining, protecting, or keeping something in existence, end quote. My criterion, or way to achieve preservation of a nation, is national security. National security, which Dictionary.com defines as, quote, a collective term for the defense in foreign relations of a country, protection of the interests of a country, end quote. Take our nation, for example. Without national security measures, we would be subject to terrorism, crimes from illegal immigrants, and the insidious decay of our country from drugs pouring in. Without national security, our nation could not be preserved. Contention 1. Preservation of a nation is government's end goal. Preservation of a nation is government's end goal. Former Senator Arlen Specter once stated, quote, the fundamental purpose of government is to protect its citizens, end quote. Government exists to protect the nation and its citizens. Preservation of a nation is the end goal of government because it is the government's intended purpose. Put it this way, what good is government if it doesn't protect its citizens? If the government upholds nationalism, it focuses more on protecting its citizens and preserving the nation. Whereas if government upholds globalism, it will prioritize the world over its citizens and it will neglect the needs of the nation. Nationalism best leads to preservation of a nation, which sustains nations, allows them to thrive, and is the government's end goal. Contention 2. Globalism does not preserve a nation. Globalism does not preserve a nation. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should completely neglect the interests of the rest of the world. We should care about international matters, but not at the expense of our own nation. If we place priority on other nations ahead of our own, we do this at the risk of harming our country. For example, in recent years, France valued globalism by allowing immigrants into their country. However, the result is that France has become extremely vulnerable to terrorist attacks, including the Bataclan attack in 2015, which, according to the local, claimed 150 lives. It is clear to the French that their nation is not being preserved. You see, if globalism is valued higher, our security as a nation will be diminished. Our borders will become lax. That may sound good to some, but in reality, the world has dangers and we must be wise. Contention 3. Nationalism preserves a nation through national security. Nationalism preserves a nation through national security. Let's look at Brexit. When Great Britain saw their membership in the European Union harming their own interests, they left the EU, declaring they valued protecting their own nation above belonging to the global interests of the EU. In fact, by leaving the EU, Britain was essentially upholding national security by protecting its borders from illegal immigrants, terrorists, and illegal drugs. Another benefit of Brexit is that it gave Britain more control over its currency, promoting financial security. They could then preserve their nation. Let's go back and take a look at my definition of nationalism. It is, quote, the doctrine that national interest, security, etc. are more important than international considerations, end quote. National security is what preserves a nation, and if we uphold it above the interests of the rest of the world, that is, by definition, nationalism. But if we uphold globalism higher, national security would be greatly diminished. Only nationalism through national security can achieve preservation of a nation. We must preserve our own children because that's what we are meant to do. So let's put priority on preserving our nation. Thank you, and now I'm ready for cross-examination.
All right, is my timer ready? And my opponent?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so would you agree that we're looking at this debate only in situations of conflict?
Yes.
Okay, so we're only looking at situations where the actor in this resolution must choose between either nationalism or globalism, correct? Not situations where we can have both. We're looking at conflict.
Yes.
Okay, great. Do we live in a perfect world?
No, we do not.
Okay. Now, would you agree that the ideas in this debate round have to apply to the real world in order to have any merit?
Of course.
All right. Does the intrinsic value of people change based on their circumstance or our ability to help them?
No, but the purpose of government is to protect the citizens within its own nation. That's what government was created to do.
Okay. So moving on from those preliminary questions to some questions about your case. Could you please repeat your definition of nationalism for me?
Okay, nationalism is defined by Collins English Dictionary as, quote, the doctrine that national interest, security, etc. are more important than international considerations.
Okay, and what was your definition of preservation?
Preservation is essentially the act of maintaining, protecting, or keeping something in existence.
Protecting, maintaining, or keeping something in existence. Okay, great. Would you agree that when we're looking at nationalism and globalism, there's this concept of non-exclusivity? So in other words, if we value nationalism above globalism or globalism above nationalism, that doesn't mean we're upholding 100% nationalism with no globalism or 100% globalism with no nationalism. The other can still exist to a certain degree, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. Now, how, in your own words, how do you define preservation of a nation?
It is essentially protecting the well-being of the nation and its citizens.
Okay, protecting the well-being of the nation and its citizens. And in your own words, how would you describe nationalism, in your own words?
nationalism is upholding the interests of a nation above the interests of the rest of the world.
Okay, the interests of a nation above the interests of the rest of the world. Fantastic. All right. Now, you talked a lot about Brexit, correct?
Correct.
Okay, were you arguing that Brexit is an example of globalism? Or how they were in the European Union, that was an example of globalism?
By being in the European Union, they were compromising their own interests for the interests of other nations.
Right, but were you arguing that them being in the European Union was an example of globalism?
Yes, I believe it was.
Okay. Does the European Union does it have members from throughout the world, or is it limited to only a certain region, namely Europe?
It is limited to Europe, but it could be a form of globalism.
Okay, fantastic. I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much. Could I have prep time in 30-second intervals, please?
Two minutes and 30 seconds left.
Thank you. No further prep time is necessary. All right. So if my timer's ready and my opponent? Mm-hmm. All right. Quote, "Don't do to other nations what we don't want happening to us." End quote. Ron Paul. It is because I agree with Ron Paul that I stand resolved that globalism ought to be valued above nationalism. Now, I agree with all the definitions my opponent gave in her last speech, so let's just move on straight to my value in this debate round. And the highest concept that I hold in this round is my value of human rights. Human rights, which are defined as the rights to life, liberty, and property. Human rights are universally recognized as the most fundamental, all-important value in society. All other values eventually point back to human rights, making it the highest value in today's debate. Now, human rights are inherently given to every individual. Therefore, to uphold human rights, we merely need to protect the rights that people already have. In other words, the best way to uphold human rights is to keep nations from ever violating them in the first place. It is my argument today that nations who value globalism will be less inclined to violate human rights. Let's explore this idea more in my two contentions, or my two main arguments. Contention 1. Nationalism justifies human rights violations. Nationalism justifies human rights violations. The phrase nationalism above globalism sounds like a great idea at first, but let's take a look at what this actually means. According to the definitions we agreed to, nationalism above globalism means that our national interests supersede the interests of other nations. But that's a very dangerous thing to say. As an analogy, what if I came up to you and said, "Judge, I value my own interests more than I value yours. Therefore, I'm going to steal your wallet, and I don't care if you don't like it because your interests don't matter as much as mine do." Would you be okay with me saying that? No, of course not. And yet, this is exactly what holding nationalism above globalism looks like. Saying that nationalism is more important than globalism is literally the same as saying that our nation can do almost anything we want to further our own national interests, even if we harm other nations in the process. A better excuse for human rights violations has never been made. In fact, nationalism above globalism has been the justification for countless human rights abuses throughout history. William of Normandy captured southern England by force because doing so was in his national interest. Hermann Göring carpet-bombed Poland to capture more territory for Germany because doing so was in the national interest. The Nazis sought to purify Germany of Jews because doing so was in their national interest. Only 4 years ago, Russia snatched Crimea away from Ukraine because doing so was in the national interest. And on I could go. All of these examples harmed either lives, liberties, or properties. And they all occurred because the offending nations valued their national interest above the global interests of other nations. Contention 2. Globalism respects human rights. Globalism respects human rights. By definition, valuing globalism above nationalism means that a country values the interests of the globe ahead of its own. Thus, when selfish national interests conflict with the interests of the rest of the world, a globalist mindset would value the other nations and refrain from violating their human rights. Recalling that the resolution's wording centers around what ought to be valued, one can see that globalism is the better choice. A great example of this is the Biological Weapons Convention, a treaty enacted in 1975 which bans nations from developing or acquiring biological weapons. The 180 nations who ratified this treaty have chosen to place the interests of the world above their own desires to develop biological weapons for use against other nations. Because they value globalism in this way, they will not violate the human rights of others through the use of these deadly weapons. And that wraps up the negative case, but I'd also like to spend some time focusing on the affirmatives case. Now, my opponent presented an interesting case in her last speech, and her value was preservation of a nation. Well, preservation of a nation is essentially the same thing as nationalism. We define nationalism as essentially protecting the interests of the nation. Nationalism focuses on the nation. Nationalism is protecting the nation. Preservation of a nation also means protecting the nation. If you think about it, nationalism, the interest of protecting your own nation, and preservation of a nation, the act of preserving your nation, are essentially the same thing. But this creates a circular argument. You see, my opponent's whole case is centered on the idea that the reason we should value nationalism is because it preserves the nation. But really what she's saying is that we should value nationalism because of nationalism. But this doesn't really say anything. It's like me telling you that you should eat pepperoni pizza because you should eat pepperoni pizza. It's actually a logical fallacy of circularity. So because of this, preservation of a nation is not the highest value in this debate round. Moving on to my second response against my opponent's value, human rights is a higher value than preservation of a nation. It's a higher value. And to look at this, we can look at an example I brought up in my negative case, the example of Hermann Göring. Now, Hermann Göring, when he carpet bombed Poland, was actually preserving the nation of Germany. He was doing exactly what my opponent's saying. He was valuing nationalism and preserving the nation. The only problem is that the way he did this was carpet bombing Poland so that the Germans could have more territory to live in. This was an act of nationalism. It fulfilled the purpose of government, like my opponent was talking about. It preserved the nation of Germany, but because it violated human rights, it was immoral and it was universally condemned. When human rights comes into conflict with preservation of a nation, when preservation of a nation harms human rights, it's no longer the highest value. Human rights is fundamentally more important than the preservation of the nation. And for these two reasons, I believe my value is higher than my opponent's. My opponent was also talking a lot about national security. This was her criterion, but I want to point out national security doesn't necessarily go away under globalism. We both agreed in cross-examination that if we value nationalism above globalism or globalism above nationalism, this doesn't mean the other side goes away. Even if you value globalism above nationalism, you'll still have some national security. That doesn't mean you just let your nation get attacked by everyone. And finally, the last thing I want to look at, if we have enough time, is her example of the French immigrants. And she was talking about how France embraced globalism and immigrants flowed into their country. However, we have even more of a problem with this under nationalism, my opponent's side, because nationalism has justified almost every human rights atrocity in the history of modern civilization. So for these reasons, I believe globalism ought to be valued above nationalism. Thank you very much.
Alright, is the timer ready? And my opponent?
Go for it.
Alright, so do you believe that globalism is the right thing to do?
What exactly do you mean by the right thing to do?
I mean...
Could you rephrase the question?
When we compare to when we have to choose between nationalism and globalism, do you believe that globalism is the right choice?
Yes, I do. That's my position as the negative team in this round.
Alright, so would it make sense for you to say that helping others is right?
Helping others is right. I'm not necessarily advocating that helping others is right, although I do believe that, but basically what I'm saying in my case is that globalism ensures that we don't harm other people. And I guess that could be considered a form of helping others, not harming them. But I'm just saying we shouldn't harm others. That's my main stance in this debate.
Okay, we should not harm other nations.
Yes.
And do you believe that nationalism harms other nations?
Yes, as I provided in my case, nationalism doesn't always harm other nations, but it provides an excuse and a justification which has been used many times throughout history to commit atrocities.
Okay,
And because of that, it's just too dangerous to value.
Okay, so would it make sense for you to say that nationalism is the wrong thing to do?
When compared to globalism, I believe globalism should be valued above nationalism, not the other way around.
Okay, therefore, by that logic, when you're comparing nationalism and globalism, would it make sense for you to say that it's wrong to care for yourself?
I'm not saying it's wrong to care for myself. As I said, even if we value globalism above nationalism, that's just holding globalism above. It doesn't mean nationalism completely goes away. So we do, of course, still have to care for ourselves. But when it comes to an issue of do we do something that we want or do we respect the wishes of others, we have to respect the wishes of others because otherwise we could just go in and harm others for our own benefit, which is immoral.
So, are you saying that we should care for ourselves, but we should care for others first?
We should, when we have to choose between when we have to choose between our own interests and the interests of other nations, we have to prioritize the interests of other nations. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, all the time?
Most of the time, yes. Almost all the time, sure.
Okay. Do you believe that nations that are weak and defenseless can achieve their goals?
Depends on what those goals are, I suppose.
Well,
in many cases, that's not possible.
All right. So would you agree that nations must be protected and strong in order for them to achieve human rights?
Not necessarily. That would also it really depends on the example. If you could perhaps give me a specific example of what you're talking about.
Well, if a nation is weak and defenseless, would it be able to achieve human rights?
Sometimes, if it can avoid harming the human rights of its citizens, that would be achieving human rights. Without with it being weak and defenseless. But if you're talking about a nation attacking another nation, then yeah, you might want to have a strong nation to protect its people from human rights.
Are we debating extremes?
Are we debating extremes? Well, I believe we have to look at the real world and how these scenarios actually play out, nationalism and globalism, and debate them practically.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. May I have prep time in 30-second intervals, please? Thank you.
Two minutes and 30 seconds left.
Thank you.
Two minutes left. One minute and 30 seconds left.
Thank you. No further prep time needed. Alright, is the timer ready? And my opponent? Alright. Quote, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. End quote. It is because I agree with American statesman Daniel Webster that I stand resolved. Nationalism ought to be valued above globalism. Now, my opponent has said several times throughout his case that preservation of a nation is not more important than human rights. And I agree, human rights can be more important than preservation of a nation. But to say that nationalism justifies human rights atrocities is a straw man. Basically, my opponent took my argument, weakened it, and then attacked that weak argument. Of course, of course, human rights is more important than preservation of a nation, but we must understand, I'm not saying nations can just harm human rights whenever they want. All nations can and should respect other nations, and all nations should respect morality. It's just when they have to choose between helping their own nation and helping another nation, that nation should choose nationalism and help their own people first, because that is what they are meant to do. And now, my opponent also said that my value of preservation of a nation is circular. And my response to this is behavior is not belief. Behavior is not belief. Nationalism is, quote, the doctrine that national interest, security, etc. are more important than international considerations, end quote. And preservation of a nation is the act of maintaining, protecting, or keeping a nation in existence. Nationalism is a doctrine or belief, while preservation of a nation is an act or a behavior. There's a big difference here. When you say I should eat ice cream, it is very different from actually eating ice cream. Saying I should eat ice cream is merely a belief that leads to eating ice cream, that behavior. So nationalism and preservation of a nation are two different things. And the belief of nationalism simply leads to the behavior of preservation of a nation. And now, my opponent brought up the value of human rights. And my first response is that globalism harms human rights. Globalism harms human rights. An example of this is a treaty known as the UNCRC. This treaty would ban or severely regulate home education. If a nation ratified this treaty, then several citizens across the nation would lose their right to liberty. Or, to be specific, they would lose the liberty to educate their children the way they desire. So globalism, while it can uphold human rights, it does not uphold human rights all the time. And now my opponent also claimed, it seems to be essentially saying that globalism has to restrain nationalism from violating human rights. But my response is that nationalism is still first. Nationalism is still first. My opponent seems to be saying that nationalism is like a bulldog and globalism is like a leash that keeps the bulldog from doing anyone harm. But if you had to choose between which one was more valuable, what would you pick? The dog, of course. The dog is more valuable than the leash. If the leash was more valuable, then we could just throw the dog away and be done with it. But I think we all agree we value the dog over the leash, even if that dog is dangerous. And it is for all these reasons I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
You have 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Two minutes left. One minute and 30 seconds. One minute left. 30 seconds left. Ten seconds. Time.
All right, is my timer ready? And my opponent? All right. Quote, human rights atrocities can be stopped. We just have to apply the right policies, end quote. John Prendergast, an American human rights activist. It is because I believe that a policy of holding globalism above nationalism is the best way to avoid violating the human rights of other nations that I stand resolved that we must value globalism above nationalism. In this speech, I'm going to present 3 voting issues, or 3 reasons why I believe a negative ballot is warranted. Now, the first thing I want to look at is the values, and I want to start off with this issue of circularity. My opponent came up in her last speech and basically said there's a difference between a belief and an act. And she said that nationalism is a doctrine or belief and preservation of a nation is an act. And these things are different. And she gave this example of ice cream, how wanting to eat ice cream is separate from the actual ice cream. However, there's still a problem here. There's still a problem of circularity, because saying that you should eat ice cream because of ice cream is still circular. And saying that you should believe in protecting your nation because of protecting your nation is still a circular argument. So even if this is true and there's a difference between a belief and an act, it's still a circular argument because these two things are still very, very close to each other. Even though they may not be exactly the same, they're close enough where it still creates a circular argument, one that doesn't really have much logical merits, and this creates a logical fallacy of circularity. And so my opponent's whole case is really based on a flawed foundation, and so we cannot value the affirmative side. Moving on to some other things, my opponent was addressing my case, and she actually admitted here that human rights can be a higher value than preservation of a nation. So when we're looking at nationalism and globalism, we should compare them to the standard of human rights. We're looking at human rights, which side leads us to this all-important value of human rights. We agree human rights is the highest value. And she was also saying I made a straw man argument in my first contention, which means I made her side look weak, and that's another logical fallacy. But she said that human rights are more important, but preservation of a nation doesn't mean that human rights are harmed. We're not going to be like Hermann Göring and just go out and violate other people's human rights to preserve our nation. However, she didn't really give much explanation for this. She just sort of said it, but she didn't provide a warrant or any reason to believe that this is true. And if we look at the real world, we see that actually this is, unfortunately, is not the case. When human rights and preservation of a nation come into conflict and we have to choose we have to choose one or the other, and we hold preservation of a nation above human rights, holding preservation of a nation above human rights means by definition that there will be times when we preserve our nation to the detriment of human rights. We preserve our nation even if this means violating human rights. We saw this with the example of Hermann Göring, who preserved the nation even though he violated many human rights by carpet bombing Poland. We saw this with many examples in my case, which went unaddressed. We saw this with William of Normandy. We saw this with the example of Crimea. All of these were examples of how nationalism harms human rights. And what this means is that human rights is a higher value than preservation of a nation. And that's the first voting issue, or the first main reason to vote for the negative side, for globalism. The second thing I want to look at is nationalism and globalism. You can tag this as nationalism and globalism. And my opponent presented an analogy with a dog versus a leash. And she said, basically, I'm portraying globalism as the leash and nationalism as the dangerous dog. And globalism is restraining the dog, but the dog is more valuable than the leash. And while I agree that most dogs are more valuable than leashes, this is not quite a analogy that fits with my case. This is a logical fallacy of a false analogy. Never in my case did I say that globalism was restraining nationalism. This is sort of the wrong way to be looking at things. Instead, nationalism and globalism are both mindsets. Nationalism is the mindset that I can do whatever I want to further my own national interests. Globalism is the mindset that I want to respect the interests of the rest of the world if they come into conflict with my own. They're two different mindsets that tell a nation what to do and how to act and how to enforce its policies. So it's not so much as a dog as a leash, as in nationalism and globalism. They're both on an equal level playing field. I mean, nationalism, the resolution, we're debating nationalism versus globalism. So it's already implied they're on an equal field. So these are just two different mindsets. Globalism is not necessarily restraining nationalism. And that leads me to the third and last voting issue I want to look at today, which is the voting issue of human rights. Now, my opponent said in her last speech that globalism sometimes harms human rights, and she gave this example of the UNCRC, which removes liberty. And I do agree that there are some instances, unfortunately, where globalism does harm human rights. However, this does not necessarily mean that my position as a negative is flawed. You see, globalism might sometimes occasionally harm one human right here and there, like the right to liberty. My opponent really only showed how it harmed the right to liberty, but there are two other human rights. There's the human right of liberty, yes, but also the human rights of life and property. She only showed that globalism sometimes harms liberty, but nationalism harms all three of these human rights, life, liberty, and property, and it does so all the time. If you look throughout and open any history book and flip through a few pages, you'll notice that pretty much every single war has occurred because the nation that was declaring war valued their own interests above the nation that they were going to attack. Nationalism above globalism has been responsible for almost every armed conflict throughout history. And these armed conflicts destroyed life, they take away property, and they destroy people's liberty. So nationalism is much more dangerous when it comes to human rights than globalism. So even if globalism harms human rights some of the time, nationalism poses a much larger threat to human rights, and thus we still need to value globalism above nationalism. And so because I believe that we must not do to other nations what we don't want happening to us, because I believe that we must not be allowed to violate the human rights of other nations in order to bolster our own nation's interests, I urge you to vote for globalism above nationalism in today's round. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking.
One minute left. Thirty seconds left. Ten seconds. Time.
Alright, is the timer ready? And my opponent? Alright. Quote, of all tasks of government, the most basic is to protect its citizens against violence, end quote. Because I agree with this quote from former U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, I stand resolved. Nationalism ought to be valued above globalism. Now, my opponent has been saying a lot in his speeches that nationalism harms human rights. But as I said before, nationalism does not automatically mean harming human rights. As I said, all nations are bound by morality. All nations, they should respect human rights of other people. The conflict happens when nations have to choose between their own people's human rights and other people's human rights. Then which human rights do we pick? The answer is simple. The purpose of government is to protect the human rights of its own nation. So all nations should put their own citizens' human rights first. Now, my opponent also agreed globalism can harm human rights, but it only harms liberty. But there's just one thing. Liberty is arguably the most important human right. We're all entitled to human rights, but liberty, if we do not have liberty, then there is no point in actually living. Globalism takes away this most important human right, liberty. Would you want to live in a society that if you do not have liberty? No, we all desire liberty, and globalism only harms it. Now, my opponent also claims that a behavior and an act are still circular. But I like to say they are still different things. A behavior is still not the same thing as an act. As I said before, they're not circular, but rather the behavior simply leads to the act. The behavior, the mindset of protecting your own citizens leads to the act of actually protecting them. So you first start by thinking it in your mind, and then that leads to you actually doing it in real life. At the end of the day, we have to make a choice. In my first contention, I showed you a quote from Arlen Specter that preservation of a nation is the purpose of government. In my second contention, I showed you the example of France that globalism does not achieve preservation of a nation. And in my third contention, I showed you the example of Brexit, that nationalism upholds national security, and that upholding national security is the definition of nationalism. It is for these reasons I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
And that's it. That's what an LD round looks like. So in the next video, we're going to explore more about LD, and you'll learn how to actually do exactly what we've done at competitions throughout the year. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.